Chapter 1. Beneath a Shattered Sky. The storm was an unexpected visitor that afternoon, sweeping through the coastal town with the urgency of an artist erasing a day's work. The once clear sky had darkened, clouds bruised with purples and grays rolling over the horizon like a tide turned upside down. Wind howled through the narrow streets, snatching away forgotten scarves and tossing them skyward. Raindrops began as whispers, then grew louder, thrumming against window panes and puddling in the grooves of uneven cobblestones. Elara Salas adjusted the strap of her weathered camera bag, her fingers fumbling with the buckles as rain splashed her cheeks and dampened her clothes. She had ventured out to capture the calm before the storm, a concept she had been exploring in her photography lately, but now calm was a distant memory. The storm had come faster than forecasted, and she found herself far from her tiny apartment tucked above a bookstore, surrounded by nothing but the wailing wind and abandoned streets. The camera hung heavy around her neck, its lens hood speckled with droplets. Elara hesitated under the awning of an antique shop, her chest rising and falling as she tried to catch her breath. The air smelled of salt and wet earth, an oddly intoxicating combination that momentarily distracted her from her predicament. Across the street, through the blur of rain and wind, a figure emerged. At first, it was indistinct, a shadow moving through the mist. Then, as lightning split the sky in a jagged, silver scar, she saw him. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, clutching a dripping umbrella that had clearly lost its battle with the wind. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and his soaked jacket clung to him like a second skin. Noah Everin had not planned to be caught in the storm either. His day had been devoted to tide pool surveys along the rocky coast, documenting the delicate ecosystems that clung to life in the ever-changing tides. The storm's arrival had sent him scrambling back toward town, his notebooks protected in a sealed bag, but his body no match for the tempest. Their paths converged in an instant. Noah dashed toward the awning where Elara stood, his long strides splashing water onto his already soaked jeans. Elara instinctively stepped back, the space too small for two people to share comfortably. She froze, unsure whether to acknowledge him or simply pretend to be engrossed in checking her camera. She chose the latter, fiddling with the dials even though there was no point in photographing anything now. Noah hesitated, noticing her discomfort. He stayed at the edge of the awning, the rain still pelting his back, his lips pressed together as if considering whether to speak. Instead, he tilted his head toward the camera hanging from her neck. "Caught out here working too, huh?" His voice would have been gentle, a warm contrast to the storm's fury, but Elara wouldn't know that. She avoided eye contact, her focus fixed on her camera. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain and the occasional growl of thunder. Noah shifted his weight, trying not to intrude further. A gust of wind tore through the street, rattling the shop sign and sending a spray of rain beneath the awning. Both instinctively stepped back, their shoulders brushing for the briefest of moments. Elara stiffened, but Noah didn't seem to notice. His gaze was on the horizon, where the storm churned the sea into a frothing frenzy. Something about the intensity of his focus stirred a flicker of curiosity in Elara. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, noting the way his brow furrowed, as though he were analyzing something far beyond the immediate chaos. It wasn't until a particularly sharp crack of thunder made her flinch that he turned back toward her, concern flickering in his dark eyes. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low enough to be nearly swallowed by the storm. Elara nodded quickly, her damp hair falling into her face. She pushed it back with a hand, revealing more of her sharp yet delicate features. She was used to being overlooked, a quiet observer in most situations. The rain began to ease, softening to a mist that coated everything in a silver sheen. Noah straightened and stepped out from under the awning, shaking his ruined umbrella before tucking it under his arm. Elara watched as he walked a few paces forward, his boots splashing in the shallow puddles. He stopped, turned back, and for the first time, met her gaze fully. "I think the worst is over," he said. Elara didn't reply, but something in the way he lingered before walking away left her unsettled. She stayed under the awning for a few more moments, watching as his figure grew smaller, eventually swallowed by the shimmering veil of rain. When she finally stepped out into the quiet aftermath, her camera felt lighter against her chest. The storm had passed, but something unspoken had lingered behind, echoing softly in the spaces they had shared. Chapter 2: Echoes in the Tides. The ocean stretched endlessly, a living canvas of shifting hues. The morning light danced on its surface, painting it with streaks of silver and pale blue. Waves whispered against the jagged rocks lining the shore, their rhythmic rise and fall carrying secrets from distant places. Noah stood at the edge of the tide pools, his boots sinking slightly into the damp sand. He had come prepared this time. Waterproof notebook, reinforced boots, and a jacket that could withstand the fickle temperament of coastal weather. As he crouched to examine the delicate world at his feet, his fingers moved deftly, jotting notes about sea stars clinging to rocks and anemones swaying like tiny dancers in the shallow water. The storm from the day before had stirred the waters, scattering remnants of the deep along the shore. Fragments of kelp, broken shells, and small creatures stranded by the tide surrounded him. Noah thrived in this, discovering patterns in chaos, uncovering stories left behind by nature's quiet fury. But as much as he tried to focus on his work, his mind wandered. Flashes of the previous day came unbidden. The rain-soaked streets, the hum of tension beneath that awning, the way the woman's camera hung like an anchor between them. He hadn't expected her to linger in his thoughts, yet there she was, woven into the fabric of the storm's memory. He shook his head and straightened, rolling his shoulders to dispel the ache from crouching too long. His gaze drifted to the horizon, where the sea met the sky in a seamless blur. This place, this wild, untamed edge of the world, always grounded him. It reminded him of his purpose, of the delicate balance he had devoted his life to understanding. Unbeknownst to him, Elara was nearby. She had risen early, chasing the morning light as it kissed the coastline. Her camera rested snugly in her hands, her eyes scanning the landscape for moments worth capturing. Photography was more than a job for her. It was a way of seeing, of piecing together fragments of a world she often felt disconnected from. She spotted him before he noticed her. At first, it was just the silhouette of a man against the vast expanse of ocean, his figure sharp against the muted colors of the shore. Then, recognition dawned. It was the same man from the storm, the one who had shared that fleeting moment beneath the awning. Elara hesitated. She wasn't one to approach strangers, let alone those who had already unsettled her carefully guarded solitude. Yet, something about him, his quiet focus, the way he seemed to move in harmony with the world around him, piqued her curiosity. From a distance, she raised her camera, adjusting the lens to frame him against the backdrop of the tide pools. Through the viewfinder, she saw details she hadn't noticed before. The way his dark hair curled slightly at the ends, still damp from the salt air, and the steady purpose in his movements. The shutter clicked softly, capturing the moment before he turned and caught her in the act. Noah's head tilted, his brow furrowing slightly as he spotted her. Elara lowered her camera quickly, feeling a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. She glanced around, as if searching for an excuse to be there. But the empty shoreline offered no distractions. He approached slowly, his strides purposeful but unhurried. As he drew closer, she gripped her camera tighter, feeling both exposed and foolish. She wasn't prepared for the unexpected softness in his expression when he stopped a few feet away. He didn't look annoyed or intrusive. If anything, he looked intrigued. "You've got a good eye," he said, gesturing toward her camera. Elara's pulse quickened. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words tangled somewhere between her thoughts and her tongue. Instead, she nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of her lens cap. Noah crouched again, this time examining a cluster of barnacles clinging to a rock. "The tide pools," he said, more to himself than to her. "They've always fascinated me, like little worlds within a world." Elara watched him, her curiosity slowly outweighing her nervousness. She shifted her weight, stepping closer but keeping a cautious distance. Her gaze followed his, landing on the vibrant patch of life he was studying. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of the waves filled the silence, weaving a strange sort of harmony between them. Noah reached into his pocket and pulled out a small sketchpad, flipping to a page filled with precise, detailed drawings of sea creatures. Elara tilted her head, intrigued. Without thinking, she lifted her camera again, capturing the way his fingers moved across the page. She knew she was documenting more than just the tide pools now. She was capturing a story, one that seemed to ripple out from the quiet presence of the man before her. When he glanced up, their eyes met fully for the first time. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You were at the storm yesterday," he said, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. Elara nodded again, feeling the warmth of the morning sun begin to thaw the awkwardness between them. She adjusted her camera strap, offering a small, almost imperceptible smile in return. The tide began to recede, pulling the water back toward the horizon, and with it, something unspoken lingered in the air between them. A shared understanding, a connection not yet fully realized but undeniably present. Elara turned and began walking back up the shore, her footsteps light and deliberate. Noah watched her go, his sketchpad resting on his knee. As she disappeared from view, he couldn't help but wonder if fate had brought their paths together again, or if the tides had simply carried her to him. Chapter 3: The Light Between Shadows. The gallery was alive with a quiet hum, the kind of subdued energy that swirled through spaces meant for contemplation. Soft classical music floated in the background, a melody as delicate as the paintings and photographs adorning the walls. Elara Salas stood near the entrance, her arms crossed loosely as she observed the crowd. She had never liked openings, even when her work was part of the exhibit. Tonight, her photographs hung in a corner of the gallery, arranged in a way that mimicked her artistic vision. Fragments of light breaking through storm clouds, the soft interplay of shadows on rocky cliffs, and the moments where the ocean seemed to hold its breath. Each image was a reflection of her inner world, a delicate balance of chaos and clarity. But while others mingled and murmured about the artwork, Elara remained on the outskirts, her back against the cool white wall. She sipped a glass of water, her eyes darting occasionally toward her photographs, searching the faces of those who stopped to admire them. The crowd was small, a mix of familiar faces from the town and a few strangers who had wandered in out of curiosity. She recognized the gallery owner, a sprightly woman with silver-streaked hair, moving between groups with practiced ease. A pair of tourists debated loudly over the symbolism of a painting nearby, their voices cutting through the otherwise hushed atmosphere. And then, as if drawn by some invisible thread, Elara's gaze landed on him. Noah Everin stood near the far end of the gallery, his tall frame silhouetted against the warm glow of a spotlight. He wasn't dressed for the occasion. His casual jacket and slightly worn boots set him apart from the more polished attendees, but he didn't seem out of place. He moved with quiet confidence, pausing to study each piece of art as if it held the answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. Elara felt her chest tighten. She hadn't expected to see him again, let alone here. She wondered briefly if it was a coincidence, or if something about her photographs had called to him. The thought made her uneasy, though she wasn't sure why. Noah, unaware of her presence, stopped in front of her display. His head tilted slightly as he studied the largest photograph. A shot of the coastline during a storm, the waves crashing against jagged rocks as a single beam of light pierced through the clouds. It was one of her favorites, a moment she had captured during a particularly tumultuous period in her life. She watched as his expression shifted, subtle but telling. There was recognition there, as though he saw not just the image but the emotions woven into it. He stepped closer, his fingers brushing his chin as he leaned in to read the small plaque beneath the photograph. "Elara Solace," he murmured, his voice too soft for anyone else to hear. She felt her cheeks warm, her name hanging in the air like a secret she hadn't meant to share. For a moment, she considered slipping out of the gallery altogether, avoiding the possibility of conversation. But something rooted her to the spot, a quiet curiosity that outweighed her discomfort. Noah turned, scanning the room until his eyes found hers. The connection was immediate, a thread pulled taut between them. He didn't smile, but his gaze held a quiet intensity that made her feel as though the rest of the room had faded away. He approached slowly, weaving through the crowd with an ease that seemed out of place for someone who spent most of his time in solitude. When he stopped a few feet away, Elara felt the weight of his presence, a magnetic pull that both intrigued and unsettled her. "Your work is compelling," he said, his voice low but steady. Elara glanced at the photographs, unsure how to respond. Compliments always felt foreign to her, like a language she hadn't yet learned to speak. She nodded slightly, her fingers tightening around her glass. "You capture something unusual," Noah continued, his gaze shifting briefly to the stormy coastline she had immortalized. "It's like you're looking for the light in places most people wouldn't bother to see." Elara blinked, startled by the accuracy of his observation. Few people understood her work that way, and even fewer articulated it so simply. "It's not just the light," she said quietly, surprising herself with the admission. "It's the contrast. The shadows make the light matter." Noah studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, as if her words had confirmed something he already knew. The gallery seemed to recede around them, the chatter of the crowd and the soft strains of music fading into the background. Elara felt the familiar urge to retreat, to slip away before the conversation grew too personal, but Noah's presence anchored her. "Do you always see the world that way?" he asked, his tone more curious than intrusive. She hesitated, unsure how to answer. Photography was her way of processing the world, of making sense of the chaos that often felt overwhelming. But explaining that to a stranger, someone who had somehow become more than just a passing figure in her life, felt daunting. Instead, she shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "It's just how I see things," she said, her voice softer now. Noah's lips quirked into a faint smile, a gesture so brief she might have imagined it. He glanced back at the photographs, his gaze lingering on the stormy coastline before turning back to her. "Well," he said, stepping back slightly, "it's a rare perspective. Don't lose it." Elara watched as he disappeared into the crowd, his presence leaving a ripple in the carefully constructed calm of her evening. She let out a slow breath, her grip on the glass loosening as she turned her attention back to her photographs. The light between shadows, that was what she had been searching for. And now, it seemed, she had found it in more ways than one. Chapter 4. Unwritten Horizons. The road stretched before them, a ribbon of asphalt winding through the untamed wilderness. Towering pines lined the edges, their silhouettes sharp against the muted sky. The early morning light had yet to fully awaken, casting the landscape in shades of blue and gray. The hum of the car engine filled the silence, steady and hypnotic, broken only by the occasional crunch of gravel beneath the tires. Elara sat in the passenger seat, her camera resting on her lap. She hadn't planned to be here, not in this car and certainly not with him. Yet here she was, miles from home, bound for a place she had never seen. Noah had proposed the trip, or perhaps suggested was a better word. She wasn't entirely sure how it had happened. Their paths had crossed again after the gallery, as though the universe had decided they weren't done with each other yet. She glanced sideways at him, noting the relaxed grip he had on the steering wheel. His focus was on the road ahead, his expression calm but intent. There was a quiet energy about him, a steadiness that made her feel both at ease and slightly unmoored. She had never been good with people, not in close quarters, and this was no exception. The landscape began to shift, the dense forest giving way to rolling hills and wide-open fields. Mist clung to the ground like a veil, softening the edges of the world. Elara felt the pull of it, her fingers itching to capture the moment. She lifted her camera, framing the view through the window, and pressed the shutter. The click of the camera broke the rhythm of the drive, a sound that felt louder than it was in the confined space of the car. Noah didn't react, his eyes still on the road. Elara exhaled quietly, relieved. She wasn't sure why she felt so self-conscious, but the weight of his presence seemed to magnify everything. Every sound, every movement, every thought. The road climbed higher, twisting and turning as it carved through the hills. The air grew cooler, and the scent of pine and earth seeped through the car's vents. Elara adjusted her seat, leaning slightly closer to the window as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds. The light was golden, soft, and fleeting, illuminating the landscape like a fleeting memory. They stopped at a lookout point, a small clearing perched on the edge of a cliff. Noah cut the engine, and the sudden silence was almost startling. Elara hesitated before stepping out of the car, the cool air wrapping around her like a whisper. The view was breathtaking, a vast expanse of valleys and mountains stretching endlessly, their peaks kissed by the morning sun. She walked toward the edge, her boots crunching softly against the gravel. The wind tugged at her hair, carrying with it the scent of distant rain. Elara lifted her camera again, framing the horizon through her lens. She adjusted the settings, her movements deliberate and practiced, and captured the moment. Behind her, she could hear Noah moving, his footsteps steady as he approached. She didn't turn to look. Instead, she focused on the scene before her, letting the silence between them settle like the mist on the hills. The sound of a notebook being opened caught her attention. She glanced over her shoulder to see him crouched a few feet away, his sketchpad balanced on his knee. He worked with the same quiet intensity she had noticed before, his pencil moving swiftly across the page. She watched him for a moment, curious but unwilling to disturb him. Her gaze returned to the horizon, but her thoughts lingered on him. There was something about the way he worked, his focus, his attention to detail, that resonated with her. It reminded her of how she approached her own art, the way she sought to capture the fleeting, the overlooked. As the sun climbed higher, the light changed, casting sharper shadows across the landscape. Elara adjusted her position, searching for new angles, new ways to tell the story of the place. She moved carefully along the edge, her focus narrowing to the details. The rough texture of the rocks beneath her feet, the way the sunlight glinted off the dew-covered grass, the distant shapes of birds gliding through the sky. Noah remained where he was, his pencil scratching faintly against the paper. The sound blended with the rustling of the wind and the distant murmur of a stream somewhere below. It was a symphony of the natural world, unspoken but deeply felt. Time seemed to stretch and bend, the moments slipping by without urgency. Elara lost herself in her work, her camera becoming an extension of herself. She moved with purpose, each frame a piece of a larger puzzle she couldn't yet see. When she finally lowered her camera, her fingers stiff from holding it too long, she realized how much the light had shifted. The sun was higher now, its warmth brushing against her skin. She turned to see Noah standing a few feet away, his sketchpad tucked under his arm. He met her gaze briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They returned to the car without speaking, the rhythm of their movements synchronized in an unspoken understanding. As the road carried them onward, Elara felt a quiet sense of fulfillment, a connection not just to the landscape but to the shared experience of capturing it. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel so alone. Chapter 5. A Language Without Words. The forest greeted them with an almost reverent stillness. Tall trees stretched skyward, their branches interlocking to form a vaulted canopy that filtered the sunlight into a mosaic of shifting patterns on the forest floor. The air was damp and cool, filled with the earthy scent of moss and fallen leaves. A faint mist lingered, curling around the trunks like a ghost reluctant to leave. Elara stepped carefully along the narrow path, her boots pressing into the soft ground. Each step released a muffled crunch of decaying leaves and twigs, the only sound in the otherwise serene environment. Her camera hung from its strap, swaying lightly against her side, its weight familiar and comforting. Noah walked a few paces ahead, his movements unhurried yet purposeful. His sketchpad was tucked under one arm, and a small satchel rested against his hip, its contents a mystery to her. He seemed to blend seamlessly into the surroundings, his dark jacket and quiet demeanor making him appear as much a part of the forest as the trees themselves. The path wound deeper into the woods, the light growing dimmer with each step. Elara felt a sense of anticipation, as though they were approaching something sacred. The forest had a way of demanding attention, its silence both soothing and unsettling. She found herself attuned to every sound, the distant rustle of leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird, the faint trickle of water somewhere out of sight. They reached a clearing, a small pocket of open space where the sunlight broke through the canopy in golden beams. The ground was carpeted with moss, its vibrant green a stark contrast to the muted tones of the trees. At the center of the clearing stood a solitary tree, its trunk wide and gnarled, its branches spreading out like arms reaching for the heavens. Noah stopped and turned slightly, as if inviting her to share in the discovery. He didn't speak. He never did, not in these moments, but his posture conveyed a quiet reverence. Elara nodded, more to herself than to him, and raised her camera. The tree was unlike any she had seen before, its presence commanding without being imposing. She moved closer, her fingers adjusting the settings on her camera with practiced ease. The lens captured the intricate details, the texture of the bark, the way the sunlight played across its surface, the delicate vines that clung to its base like an embrace. She circled the tree, seeking different angles, her movements slow and deliberate. Each click of the shutter felt like a small act of worship, a way of preserving the moment's significance. She lost herself in the process, the world narrowing to the frame of her lens. When she finally lowered the camera, she noticed Noah seated near the edge of the clearing, his back against a smaller tree. His sketchpad rested on his knee, and his pencil moved with quiet precision. He was drawing the clearing, she realized, capturing its essence in a way that was both similar to and entirely different from her own method. Elara hesitated, then sat on the moss-covered ground a short distance away. She placed her camera beside her and leaned back, letting the rough bark of a tree press against her spine. Her gaze wandered upward, following the branches as they tangled and stretched toward the light. The forest seemed to breathe around her, its silence alive with subtle movement. Leaves swayed gently in the breeze, their edges catching the light like tiny mirrors. Somewhere in the distance, the call of a bird echoed, clear and melodic. Elara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sounds wash over her, a symphony of the natural world. Time passed slowly, marked only by the shifting patterns of light and shadow. Elara opened her eyes to find the clearing unchanged, yet somehow different. The sun had shifted, its rays now casting the tree in a softer, more diffused light. She reached for her camera instinctively, capturing the new scene with a sense of urgency, as if it might disappear at any moment. Noah stood and stretched, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He glanced at his sketch, nodding to himself before closing the pad and tucking it into his satchel. Without a word, he began to explore the perimeter of the clearing, his gaze scanning the forest floor as if searching for something specific. Elara watched him, her curiosity piqued. She didn't move to follow, instead remaining rooted in her spot. Her camera hung loosely in her hands, her attention divided between the tree and the man moving quietly among the shadows. When Noah returned, he carried a small fragment of bark, its surface etched with intricate patterns. He placed it carefully on a rock near the tree, arranging it with a precision that suggested it was more than just a piece of debris. Elara tilted her head, intrigued but unwilling to disturb the quiet ritual. As the afternoon wore on, the clearing seemed to shift in mood, its light growing warmer and softer. Elara felt a strange sense of peace, a connection to the place that she couldn't fully explain. She realized she had stopped thinking about her photographs or what they might mean to others. In this moment, the act of creation felt purely for herself, an offering to the forest rather than an audience. When the first hint of twilight began to creep through the trees, Noah glanced at her and nodded toward the path. Elara rose without hesitation, brushing stray leaves from her jacket. She slung her camera over her shoulder and followed him, their footsteps weaving a rhythm through the fading light. The forest seemed to exhale as they left, its stillness settling back into place. The clearing disappeared behind them, but its memory lingered, a shared moment of quiet discovery etched into the fabric of the day. Chapter 6: The Gravity of Us. The river wound through the valley like a thread of silver, its surface shimmering under the late afternoon sun. The sound of rushing water filled the air, a low, rhythmic murmur that seemed to breathe life into the quiet landscape. The banks were lined with smooth stones, their surfaces polished by the constant caress of the current. Small pools collected in the shallows, their crystal-clear depths reflecting the sky like fragments of a shattered mirror. Elara walked along the riverbank, her steps slow and deliberate. The ground beneath her feet was soft, a mixture of damp earth and scattered pebbles. Her boots left faint impressions in the mud, marks that would be erased with the next rainfall. She carried her camera loosely, her fingers brushing against its surface as if it were an extension of herself. The river had a way of pulling her focus, its ceaseless flow both soothing and hypnotic. She paused to study the interplay of light and water, the way the sunlight refracted into a spectrum of colors as it danced across the ripples. She crouched low, adjusting the lens until the image in her viewfinder became a perfect frame of movement and stillness. The shutter clicked, breaking the rhythm of the river for a fleeting moment. Elara straightened, exhaling softly as she lowered the camera. She let her gaze wander across the landscape, taking in the jagged cliffs that rose on either side of the valley. Their shadows stretched long and sharp, darkening the edges of the river as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Noah was further upstream, his figure a dark silhouette against the glinting water. He moved with the same quiet precision she had come to associate with him, his attention focused on something just out of her sight. She had learned to let him work without interruption, to respect the silent boundaries they seemed to have agreed upon without ever discussing them. Elara shifted her attention back to the river. She followed its course with her eyes, tracing the way it curved and twisted, carving a path through the valley as it had done for centuries. She wondered how many others had stood where she was now, watching the same water flow past. The thought made her feel small, in a way that was oddly comforting. She stepped closer to the edge, her boots crunching against the loose stones. A fallen tree stretched across the river a few yards away, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like a skeleton's hand. Moss clung to its surface, soft and vibrant, a testament to the resilience of life. Elara raised her camera again, framing the fallen tree against the backdrop of rushing water. She adjusted the settings carefully, her movements methodical as she sought to capture the balance of textures and light. The shutter clicked once, then again, each shot a fragment of a larger story she was trying to tell. The sound of splashing drew her attention upstream. She turned to see Noah wading into the shallows, the water lapping at his boots as he bent to examine something on the riverbed. His movements were deliberate, his posture relaxed yet intent. He reached down, his hand disappearing beneath the surface for a moment before emerging with a smooth, flat stone. He stood there for a while, turning the stone over in his hand as if considering its significance. Elara watched him from a distance, her camera forgotten for the moment. There was something about the way he moved, the quiet focus he brought to even the smallest tasks, that drew her attention. As the sun sank lower, the light began to shift, casting the valley in hues of gold and amber. The water glowed with a soft radiance, its surface alive with reflections. Elara felt the familiar pull of inspiration, an almost physical need to capture the fleeting beauty of the moment. She moved along the bank, her boots slipping slightly on the damp stones. She crouched near the edge of the water, her camera steady in her hands as she framed the scene before her. The fallen tree, the glinting river, the distant figure of Noah, all elements of a composition that felt both accidental and intentional. The shutter clicked again, a sound that seemed to echo across the valley. Elara straightened slowly, her gaze lingering on the river as it continued its endless journey. She felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of having captured something true, even if she couldn't quite define what it was. Noah had moved further downstream, his figure growing smaller against the expanse of the valley. Elara watched him for a moment before turning her attention back to the river. She crouched again, this time focusing on the smaller details, the way the light caught on a single droplet of water clinging to a blade of grass, the intricate patterns etched into the surface of a weathered stone. Time slipped away, marked only by the changing light and the steady rhythm of the river. By the time Elara rose again, her legs stiff from crouching, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and violet. The air grew cooler, the shadows longer, as the day began its slow transition into night. She glanced upstream, searching for Noah, but he was no longer visible. She wasn't worried. They had both developed a sense of trust in the quiet spaces between them. She knew he would reappear when he was ready, just as she would if their roles were reversed. The river seemed to quiet as the last light faded, its surface darkening to a deep, reflective black. Elara stood for a moment, her camera hanging at her side, and let the silence of the evening wash over her. When Noah finally emerged from the shadows, his sketchpad tucked under one arm, he didn't meet her gaze. Instead, he walked past her, his footsteps soft against the stones, and began the climb back up the bank. Elara followed, their movements synchronized in a way that felt natural, as though they had been walking this path together for much longer than they actually had. The river continued to flow behind them, its song fading into the distance as they made their way back toward the road. The valley fell into darkness, but the echoes of the water lingered in Elara's mind, a reminder of the quiet beauty they had found and captured in its fleeting moments. Chapter 7. Threads of the Infinite. The field stretched endlessly before them, a sea of tall, golden grass swaying gently in the breeze. It seemed to shimmer under the midday sun, its surface rippling like water. The horizon was a hazy line where the earth met the sky, blurred by the heat that rose in invisible waves. It was a place untouched by time, as though it had existed in this state forever, waiting for someone to notice. Elara stood at the edge, her boots resting in the last traces of compacted dirt from the path behind her. The camera strap tugged gently at her neck as she adjusted its position, her fingers brushing over the worn leather. The field seemed alive with motion, the grasses whispering secrets to one another as the wind wove through them. Noah had already stepped into the field, his figure cutting a dark line through the golden expanse. His pace was measured, his movements precise as he carried his sketchpad in one hand. He didn't look back, but Elara knew he was aware of her presence. She hesitated only for a moment before following, her steps careful as she pushed through the grasses. The field was deceptive in its simplicity. Up close, it revealed a world of intricate detail, the delicate veining of each blade, the way sunlight glinted off tiny dewdrops still clinging to the stalks. Elara stopped frequently, lifting her camera to capture these hidden moments. The shutter clicks punctuated the rustling of the grass, a rhythm that felt both foreign and harmonious. As she moved deeper into the field, the landscape seemed to shift. The distant hills that bordered the horizon became more pronounced, their shapes rising like waves frozen in time. Shadows danced across the grasses, their edges soft and ephemeral. Elara felt as though she were walking through a dream, the world around her simultaneously vivid and surreal. Noah had stopped ahead of her, his figure still and silent. He stood at the base of a solitary tree that rose unexpectedly from the center of the field, its presence striking against the otherwise unbroken expanse. The tree's trunk was dark and knotted, its branches twisting skyward as though reaching for something unseen. Elara approached slowly, her camera raised to capture the scene. The contrast between the golden field and the dark, weathered tree was striking, a composition that seemed almost too perfect to be real. She framed the shot carefully, adjusting her position until the elements aligned in a way that felt balanced yet dynamic. The tree cast a long shadow that stretched across the field like an invitation. Elara stepped into its cool shade, the temperature dropping noticeably as she stood beneath the canopy. She tilted her head back, studying the interplay of light and leaves above her. Sunbeams filtered through the gaps, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted with the breeze. Noah was seated at the base of the tree, his sketchpad open on his lap. His pencil moved swiftly, tracing lines that only he could see. Elara watched him for a moment, noting the way his expression remained focused yet calm. He seemed at home here, as though the field and the tree were a part of him, or perhaps he was a part of them. She lowered herself to the ground, the grass soft beneath her. Her camera rested in her lap, its weight familiar and grounding. She didn't lift it again immediately, instead allowing herself a moment to simply exist within the space. The wind carried the faint scent of wildflowers, their presence revealed only by small bursts of color hidden among the grasses. The field was alive with sound, a symphony of nature that played softly in the background. The rustling of the grass, the distant hum of insects, the occasional call of a bird. They all blended into a melody that felt both ancient and new. Elara closed her eyes, letting the sounds wash over her like a tide. When she opened them again, the light had shifted, casting the field in a warm, golden glow. She reached for her camera instinctively, drawn to the way the colors deepened and softened with the changing light. Each shot felt like a piece of the story she was trying to tell, a way of preserving the ephemeral beauty of the moment. Noah had moved again, his sketchpad now resting on the ground beside him. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Elara followed his line of sight, her eyes tracing the gentle curve of the hills as they faded into the distance. The scene was quiet, yet it hummed with a kind of energy, as though the land itself was alive with possibilities. She rose slowly, brushing bits of grass from her jeans. Her camera hung from its strap, swinging lightly against her side as she took a step closer to the tree. She placed a hand on its rough bark, feeling the coolness of its surface beneath her palm. It was solid and unyielding, a stark contrast to the softness of the grasses that surrounded it. The sun dipped lower, its rays turning the field into a sea of fire. The grasses seemed to glow from within, their golden tones deepening into amber and copper. Elara lifted her camera one last time, capturing the transformation before the light began to fade. As the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, the field grew quieter, its whispers softening into silence. Elara and Noah began the walk back toward the path, their movements slow and unhurried. The grasses closed behind them, erasing any trace of their presence. The field remained as it was, untouched and eternal, holding within it the echoes of their quiet exploration. It was a place of secrets and stories, a reminder of the beauty that existed in the spaces between. And as they left it behind, Elara felt a sense of gratitude for the field, for the tree, and for the moments she had been given to capture them. Chapter 8. A Quiet Universe. The road ahead stretched endlessly, a ribbon of dark asphalt that disappeared into the night. The pale light of the waxing moon bathed the landscape in an ethereal glow, casting long shadows across the uneven surface. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and the lingering perfume of distant flowers that bloomed only in the dark hours. The sky above was a tapestry of stars, their cold light shimmering like scattered diamonds. Elara walked alone, her footsteps muted by the thickening grass that lined the roadside. The weight of her camera against her chest felt familiar, a constant presence that had become as integral to her as her own heartbeat. She moved with purpose, her gaze shifting between the road and the night around her. The soft wind stirred the grasses, their blades rustling like whispers, the sound adding an almost haunting quality to the stillness of the evening. It was the kind of quiet that was all-encompassing, where every movement seemed magnified, every breath drawn sharply into the cool night air. She inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the silence settle over her. Noah had disappeared some time ago, his figure fading into the darkness ahead, leaving Elara to her own thoughts. She wasn't bothered by his absence. He often preferred to slip into the shadows when the world around them grew too loud. She had learned to appreciate these moments of solitude, when the only company she kept was her own reflection in the quiet world around her. The moonlight glinted off the road, its pale glow creating a surreal, almost dreamlike quality to the scene. Elara's eyes drifted upward, following the curve of the sky as it stretched above her, an endless expanse of stars. There was something soothing about the vastness, a reminder of how small she truly was in the grand scheme of the world. The road twisted ahead, bending around the curve of the hill, and Elara's gaze followed its path, the dark ribbon of asphalt fading into the night. A flash of movement caught her eye, a small animal darting across the road, its silhouette disappearing into the underbrush. She paused for a moment, watching the spot where it had vanished, the only sign of its passing the faint rustling of the leaves. Elara's fingers instinctively reached for her camera, raising it slowly to her eye. She wasn't sure why she felt compelled to capture the moment, but something in the quiet movement of the world around her urged her to. She snapped a picture of the empty road, the moonlight casting sharp shadows across the surface. The image, though simple, felt like a reflection of the night itself. Lonely, yet strangely beautiful. She continued walking, her steps steady, the click of the camera's shutter echoing in the silence. The world around her seemed to shrink, the darkness pressing in, enclosing her in a cocoon of solitude. There was no sound except the whisper of the wind and the soft rustling of leaves. As she walked, her thoughts drifted back to the moments she had shared with Noah, to the quiet intimacy they had built in the spaces between their shared silences. She had grown accustomed to the way they existed side by side, the way their paths crossed but never fully converged. It was a connection that was felt in the quiet moments, the ones where words weren't necessary. She wondered if he felt the same way, or if he simply moved through the world with the same quiet grace, unaffected by the stillness that clung to her. The road narrowed as it wound deeper into the hills, the shadows growing longer, the moonlight more distant. Elara's steps slowed as she reached the crest of the hill, her gaze sweeping across the valley below. The land seemed to stretch forever, bathed in a silvery glow that made everything appear both sharp and soft at once. In the distance, the faint outline of a house appeared, its silhouette outlined against the backdrop of the dark sky. The light from a single window flickered, casting a brief, uneven glow across the landscape. The sight pulled at Elara's curiosity, the quiet mystery of the place drawing her in despite herself. She continued down the road, the house growing closer with each step. It was an old structure, its stone walls weathered by time, its roof sloping in a way that suggested it had once been grand but had since fallen into disrepair. The moonlight glinted off the broken windows, giving the place an eerie, almost ghostly quality. As Elara approached, she slowed, her breath catching in her throat as a strange sense of unease settled over her. The house seemed to stand at the edge of the world, its presence almost unnatural in the stillness of the night. She couldn't explain why, but it felt as though the very air around the place was charged with something. An energy, perhaps, or a memory that lingered in the walls. The door to the house creaked open, the sound sharp in the otherwise still night. Elara paused, her heart beating a little faster as the silhouette of a figure emerged from the shadows of the doorway. For a moment, she thought it might be Noah, but the figure was too still, too distant. It remained in the doorway, its shape barely discernible in the low light. She raised her camera, instinctively capturing the scene before her. The click of the shutter seemed impossibly loud in the silence that surrounded her. When she lowered the camera, the figure had vanished, leaving only the empty doorway behind. Elara stood frozen for a moment, her fingers tight around the camera, her heart thudding in her chest. The stillness of the night had returned, but it felt different now, as though something had shifted in the air. She could feel it, the subtle weight of something unseen, just beyond the edge of her perception. The road seemed to stretch out before her, the house fading into the distance as the night pressed in around her. She continued walking, the click of her boots on the asphalt the only sound in the world. But as she moved forward, a thought lingered in her mind, one that she couldn't shake no matter how hard she tried. That house was not just a house. It was something more, something that had been waiting for her. And she knew, deep down, that she would have to return. Chapter 9. Where Oceans End. The morning arrived slowly, a soft whisper of light pushing through the thick branches of the trees that lined the edge of the forest. Elara stood at the edge of the clearing, the coolness of the early morning air biting at her skin. The sun had yet to rise fully, its rays only a hint of gold on the horizon, just enough to cast long shadows across the dew-soaked ground. The earth beneath her feet was damp from the night's chill, the soil clinging to her boots as she shifted her weight. She had come here to find something, perhaps a piece of the landscape that she hadn't yet captured or a moment that had eluded her the day before. It had been 2 days since she had stood at the edge of the field, her camera resting heavy in her hands, her thoughts as scattered as the light that filtered through the leaves. The house in the distance had stayed with her, its presence lingering in the back of her mind like an unfinished sentence, something unspoken but understood. She needed to return. But for now, she was here, standing in the quiet shadows of the forest, her gaze fixed on the old oak tree that stood in the center of the clearing. It was massive, its trunk thick with age, its branches gnarled and twisted like the arms of a forgotten god. The leaves above rustled faintly in the breeze, their movement almost imperceptible against the stillness of the morning. The oak seemed to dominate the landscape, its presence both commanding and comforting. Elara took a slow step forward, her boots crunching softly against the carpet of fallen leaves. She moved cautiously, as if the ground itself held some sort of secret, something just beneath the surface that she wasn't yet ready to uncover. She paused as she reached the base of the tree, her hand resting lightly against its rough bark. The texture was familiar, the deep ridges worn smooth by centuries of wind, rain, and time. For a moment, she simply stood there, her palm pressed against the tree, feeling the steady rhythm of its ancient pulse beneath her fingertips. There was something about it, something that felt both grounding and otherworldly. The tree had witnessed centuries of change, had stood watch over this land long before she had arrived, and would remain long after she had gone. Her fingers traced the bark, following the lines that seemed to tell their own story, one of resilience, of survival. Elara's mind wandered to Noah, his quiet presence often like a shadow at the edges of her world. He had been the one to point out this oak, mentioning it in passing as though it were an old friend, someone who had earned their respect over time. He had never said much about it, only that the oak had stood here for longer than anyone could remember. Elara knew she had to photograph it, to capture its solemn beauty. The light was right now, the soft glow of the rising sun filtering through the canopy above, casting the tree in a kind of ethereal light. She raised her camera, her hands steady as she framed the shot. The oak's branches seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky, twisting and reaching for something unknown, as though it were part of some great, forgotten network. The shutter clicked, the sound sharp in the still morning air. Elara lowered the camera but did not move away from the tree. Instead, she took a step back, watching the way the light shifted across the gnarled bark, the way the shadows stretched long and thin across the ground. The image in her mind was clear now, the scene before her crystallizing into something deeper than just a photograph. She could feel it, the weight of the history embedded in the tree's ancient roots, the way it had stood silently through seasons of change, through storms and droughts, through the quiet passing of countless days. There was a stillness to it, a peace that seemed to emanate from the very core of the oak. Elara found herself drawn into that stillness, her thoughts quieting as the world around her fell into place. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves above and sending a cascade of golden light flickering across the ground. Elara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cool breeze sweep over her skin. There was something almost sacred in this place, something beyond the physical world, and it filled her with a quiet sense of awe. When she opened her eyes again, her gaze shifted toward the horizon, where the first traces of sunlight were beginning to spread across the sky. The forest was waking up, the distant sounds of birds and insects growing louder, filling the silence with life. It was a new day, and yet, as Elara stood beneath the old oak, she felt as though time itself had slowed to a crawl. The world around her felt suspended, caught in the space between moments. She moved slowly around the tree, her eyes scanning the base where the roots twisted out of the earth, their thick tendrils forming natural arches and hollow spaces. She crouched low, her fingers brushing against the cool earth as she traced the outline of a root that jutted up from the ground like a twisted arm reaching toward the sky. The soil was soft here, damp with the remnants of the morning dew, and Elara couldn't help but feel that there was something beneath the surface, something that the earth was keeping hidden. Her hand hovered just above the ground, her fingertips barely grazing the soil. She could sense a pull, a faint vibration in the earth beneath her, as though the very roots of the tree were alive with memory. She closed her eyes again, letting the feeling wash over her. It was as if the tree itself was whispering to her, its ancient voice carried on the wind, its stories hidden deep within the roots and the bark. Elara stood, brushing the dirt from her hands as she took a final look at the tree. It was not just a tree. It was a monument to time itself, a keeper of secrets and stories that span generations. It was a reminder of the enduring power of nature, of the way the world moved in its own rhythm, independent of human lives, but infinitely connected to them. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the canopy, casting the clearing in a warm, golden light, Elara felt the weight of the moment settle into her chest. She turned away from the oak and began walking back toward the edge of the forest, the path ahead of her now bathed in the full light of morning. Her thoughts were quieter now, the noise of the world falling away as she walked, leaving only the soft rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. The day was unfolding, but Elara couldn't shake the feeling that there was something still waiting for her, something she had yet to discover beneath the surface of the earth and the sky. The oak had shared its quiet wisdom with her, and in that silence, she had come to understand something deeper, something she hadn't known she was searching for. The world was full of stories, and she was only just beginning to learn how to listen. Chapter 10. Fractured Reflections. The sun had climbed higher in the sky by the time Elara returned to the house, though it still felt like the world had yet to fully wake. There was a stillness in the air, the kind that hung in the space between moments, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed some unseen threshold. The road leading up to the house seemed more distant now, as though it had stretched out of reach while she had been away. She stood at the edge of the property, looking up at the house from the familiar vantage point she had first seen it from. The crumbling stone walls seemed more imposing in the daylight, their weathered surfaces catching the sun's rays in a way that made them glow faintly against the surrounding landscape. The windows, once dark and empty, now seemed to stare back at her, as though they held some secret that she had yet to understand. There was a weight to the air around her, an unspoken tension that she couldn't place. The house seemed to breathe with the wind, its walls exhaling a sigh as though it had been waiting for her return. Elara hesitated for a moment, a vague unease settling over her. She had never thought much of the house before, had never felt a connection to it beyond the quiet curiosity it had stirred in her. But something had shifted in her, something that made her feel as if the house and the land that surrounded it were no longer separate entities. They were intertwined, connected in a way she couldn't explain. She moved slowly toward the house, her steps deliberate but cautious, as if the ground itself might shift beneath her. The garden, which had once appeared wild and untended, now seemed almost cultivated, the tangled vines and overgrown shrubs having taken on an unnatural order. There was something unsettling in the way the plants grew, the way they reached toward the house as though drawn to it. Elara paused by the edge of the garden, her eyes scanning the wild growth that crept along the stone walls. It felt as though the house itself had begun to reclaim the land, as if it were slowly pulling the earth into its grasp. She wondered, not for the first time, if there was something alive within the walls of the house, something that existed beyond the physical, something that lingered in the spaces between the cracks and shadows. The closer she came, the more she could feel it, an almost palpable presence, as though the house itself were watching her. The feeling was not entirely unpleasant, but it was strong enough to make her pulse quicken, to make her mind race with questions that she could not answer. What was it about this place that held such a tight grip on her? Why did it call to her, even when she was not here? Her fingers brushed against the stone as she reached the door, the rough texture cool under her touch. She had seen this door before, of course, had passed it countless times in the past days, but now it felt different. It felt as though it were a threshold she was about to cross, one that would take her into a place where the rules of the world she knew no longer applied. The door creaked open with a heavy groan, and Elara stepped inside. The air was thick and heavy, as if the house had been holding its breath in her absence. The interior was dim, the light filtering through the dust-covered windows and muted shafts, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. The silence was oppressive, wrapping around her like a blanket, making every movement feel like a disruption in the stillness. The walls seemed to close in around her as she moved deeper into the house, the space growing more unfamiliar with each step. There was a scent in the air, old, musty, like forgotten memories trapped in the very fabric of the house. The faint traces of something sweet lingered too, a floral fragrance that seemed to cling to the air like a ghost. It reminded her of the flowers that bloomed around the garden, the ones that had seemed so out of place in the wildness of the land. She wandered through the halls, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Every room she entered seemed to hold a piece of the house's history, a fragment of something lost and forgotten. The faded wallpaper peeled at the edges, the furniture covered in dust, the remnants of lives that had once filled these rooms. But as Elara moved from one space to the next, she began to notice something odd, something that she hadn't seen before. In every room, there were traces of something not entirely gone. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper than they should be, the dust on the furniture disturbed, as if someone had been here recently, moving things just slightly out of place. The sense of presence grew stronger, more insistent, and Elara felt a chill settle over her skin. It was as if the house itself were remembering, as though it were awakening after a long slumber. She moved slowly, almost hesitantly, toward the staircase at the far end of the hall. The stairs were narrow and creaked under her weight as she ascended, each step amplifying the silence around her. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before her, lined with closed doors that led into rooms shrouded in darkness. One of the doors, however, stood slightly ajar. Elara paused before it, her hand resting on the cool doorknob. The air seemed heavier here, as though the house were holding its breath in anticipation. She hesitated for a moment, uncertainty crawling beneath her skin. But then, with a sense of inevitability, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was small and dimly lit, the only light coming from a cracked window that let in a thin sliver of daylight. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with books and trinkets that looked as though they had been untouched for years. In the center of the room, an old rocking chair sat motionless, its wood worn smooth by time. Elara stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room as if it held the answers she had been searching for. There was an odd, almost suffocating quality to the air in here, something that made her feel both drawn to it and repelled by it at the same time. It was a room frozen in time, holding onto the past with a quiet intensity, and yet there was a subtle sense of life here, life that had never truly left. She walked to the center of the room, her gaze drawn to the small, intricately carved box sitting atop a nearby table. It was unremarkable in appearance, but something about it caught her attention. Her fingers brushed against the smooth surface, feeling the faint vibrations of something hidden beneath. There was a quiet pulse to it, as if it held within it something the house had been waiting to reveal. The sensation was unsettling, yet compelling. Elara's pulse quickened as she reached for the box, her hand trembling ever so slightly as she lifted it. The moment she touched it, she could feel the weight of the house's memory press against her chest, and she knew, in that instant, that whatever lay within this box was not meant to be found. Yet, she couldn't stop herself. The house had guided her here, and it would not let her leave without uncovering its truth. She opened the box. Chapter 11. Of Love and Resilience. The moment the box creaked open, the air in the room shifted. It was subtle at first, a slight change in the atmosphere, as if something unseen had stirred in the shadows. Elara's breath caught in her chest, her fingers hovering just above the contents of the box. The room seemed to hold its breath with her, the silence pressing in from every side. Inside the box was a small, weathered book, its leather cover cracked with age. The edges were worn, the pages yellowed with time. And yet there was an unmistakable aura of something alive about it, something that transcended its physical form. It felt heavier than it should have, as though it contained more than the weight of paper and ink. Elara's fingers trembled as she reached for the book, the cool leather slipping beneath her touch. She had the strangest sensation, as if the house was watching her, waiting for her to make her next move. She hesitated for only a moment, then carefully pulled the book from the box, feeling the subtle thrum of energy that pulsed through it. The book was unmarked, its surface bare except for the faintest outline of what seemed to be a symbol, one that was nearly faded, worn smooth with time. Elara turned it over in her hands, inspecting every inch, but there was no title, no indication of what it might be. It was as though it had no history, no identity, nothing but this strange, intangible presence. With a deep breath, Elara opened the first page. The pages were fragile, and as she turned them, they whispered in her fingers, as if speaking a language that was only just out of reach. The writing inside was neat and careful, the ink faded but still legible, curling and looping across the paper in a way that felt both familiar and strange. Each word seemed to echo, as though it had been written with a purpose beyond the simple act of recording thoughts. The text was unlike anything Elara had ever seen. It wasn't a diary or a journal, but something else, something that spoke of events that couldn't be placed in any fixed moment in time. The words were filled with longing and fear, with the weight of decisions that had been made long before she had arrived. As she flipped through the pages, one entry stood out among the rest. It was marked by a strange, almost imperceptible symbol, the same one that had been etched on the cover. The ink was darker here, more pronounced, as if the author had been compelled to write this passage with urgency. Elara's eyes moved over the words, her heart beginning to race as she read the fragmented sentences. The house remembers what we forget. It is a keeper of our desires, our grief, our sins. To step within its walls is to become part of its story. We cannot leave until we have fulfilled the promise we made long ago. The words were chilling, their meaning elusive. Elara's hand shook slightly as she turned the page, the next passage beginning with the same strange symbol. It was as if the book was urging her to continue, to uncover whatever lay hidden within its pages, to unlock the truth that had been buried for so long. The more she read, the clearer the connections became. The entries seemed to blur together, weaving a tale of a family, of people who had lived here before her, their lives intertwined with the house in ways that felt both haunting and inevitable. The house had not simply been a shelter, a place of refuge. It had been a witness to every secret, every unspoken word, every hidden truth. Elara's eyes burned with the intensity of what she was uncovering. The weight of the book in her hands seemed to grow heavier, its presence more insistent, as if the house itself were demanding that she understand. The next page was different from the others. The words were still written in the same careful script, but this time, the ink had bled into the paper, as though the author's hand had faltered in the final moments. The passage was incomplete, the ink smudged, but what was legible sent a wave of cold fear rushing through Elara's veins. We cannot undo what has been done. The house knows what we did. It knows all that we hid. Elara's stomach twisted at the words. What had happened here? What was it that the house knew? There was a presence in the air, something ancient and powerful, as if the house had borne witness to events far darker than Elara could comprehend. Her fingers moved, almost against her will, to the next page, where the words became increasingly erratic, the sentences broken and disjointed. She could feel the pulse of the house around her, the air thick with the weight of its history. It seemed to close in on her, its walls pressing tighter, its floors creaking beneath her feet. It will not let us leave. Not until we have confessed, not until we have given it what it demands. We are bound to it. We always have been. Elara slammed the book shut, her breath coming in short gasps. The room felt as though it were spinning, the walls twisting in on themselves, the shadows stretching unnaturally. She had been so absorbed in the book, in the story it was trying to tell her, that she hadn't noticed how the temperature had dropped, how the light from the window had dimmed. The silence in the room was suffocating now, the weight of the house pressing down on her with unbearable intensity. Elara stood frozen, the book resting heavily in her lap, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just read. What did it mean that she was bound to the house? What had been promised, and why was the house so determined to hold onto those promises? She looked around, as though expecting the walls to answer, but there was nothing, only the deep, unyielding silence that filled every corner of the room. Suddenly, the air shifted again, the temperature dropping even further, and Elara could feel something stirring in the darkness. It was as though the house had heard her thoughts, as though it had been waiting for this moment, this breaking point. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards, so faint at first that Elara thought it was her imagination, but then it grew louder, reverberating through the walls. Her heart pounded in her chest. The house was awake, and it was waiting for her to make her next move. The floor beneath her feet groaned as though it were shifting, as though the very foundations of the house were rearranging themselves. Elara stood, her legs unsteady, and as she glanced toward the door, she realized with sudden clarity that there was no way out. The house was no longer simply a building. It was alive, and she was part of its story now. Chapter 12, Eclipsed by You. The room felt suffocating now, the air thick with the soundless hum that reverberated through every inch of the house. The walls seemed to pulse in rhythm with the vibrations beneath her feet, and Elara, though frozen in place, could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her chest. It was as though the very essence of the house had taken form, its presence materializing around her, its influence threading into her every thought, every breath. She was no longer merely an observer of this place. She had become part of it. Her eyes darted to the corners of the room, but there was nothing visible, no figures in the shadows, no movement. Yet she could sense them. The house had memories, and those memories had begun to stir, crawling out of the spaces between the walls, between the moments in time. They were ancient, unsettling, and they clung to her, their weight heavy in her mind. She had not simply found the house. The house had found her, and it had been waiting for her all along. The ground beneath her seemed to tremble once more, and she took a step backward, the book in her hand growing heavier with every movement. It was as if the house was telling her something, urging her to understand the final piece of the puzzle it had been constructing all this time. She could feel it, the pulse of the house, growing stronger, louder, a heartbeat in the floorboards, in the walls, in the very air around her. The echoing hum intensified, and Elara knew without knowing how that it was coming from within her, that it was part of her, woven into her very being. The house had not just waited for her to arrive. It had been drawing her in, pulling her closer with each passing moment, and now it was asking her to understand the cost of her arrival. She looked around the room, the space now entirely unfamiliar, though it was the same as when she had entered. The shadows were darker, the air colder, and the walls seemed to bend in on themselves, folding in and out of focus as if the very fabric of reality were losing its shape. Time itself felt fluid, shifting, no longer a constant. The house had become something beyond time, beyond space. It had become a force of its own, and Elara could not escape it. With every breath, she felt herself sinking deeper into its hold, its vast and insistent pull. She could no longer tell where she ended and the house began. Her mind, her soul, seemed to be merging with the foundation beneath her feet, with the very stones that made up the walls, with the air that clung to her skin. She was no longer just inside the house. She was the house. The book in her hands throbbed with a pulse of its own, and Elara's gaze fell once more to the pages. They had blurred and shifted, as if rewriting themselves, as if responding to the chaos around her. She could still make out the letters, though they seemed to shift in and out of clarity, like whispers at the edge of comprehension. The last passage she had read, the one that had spoken of the house's demands, now seemed more pressing, more urgent. We are bound to it. We always have been. And until we fulfill its demand, it will never let us go. The words felt like a warning now, though she couldn't say what they meant. What demand? What was the house asking of her? Her mind raced, flashes of images and memories colliding in a disorienting blur. She thought of the people who had lived here before her, of their lives, their desires, their fears. She thought of the symbols, the unspoken promises woven into the very fabric of the house. She thought of the feeling that had grown inside her, the strange, undeniable pull that had drawn her to this place and to this room. It was not just the house that remembered, it was her. The realization hit her like a wave, the force of it sweeping over her, drowning her in the sudden understanding. She was not merely an outsider, a visitor. She had always been part of this house, part of its story, part of the promise that had been made long before she had even known its name. Her heart beat faster as the truth unfolded in her mind. The house had called to her, not to trap her, but to bring her home. She was not a stranger here. She was its keeper, its inheritor. The memories, the promises, the weight of everything that had transpired within these walls. They were hers now. She had been chosen long before her arrival, long before she had ever stepped onto the land. The room seemed to sway, the air thickening as though it were charged with electricity. Elara's vision blurred, the edges of the room darkening as the weight of the house's history pressed down on her. She felt herself fall to her knees, the book slipping from her grasp, its pages fluttering as though caught in some invisible wind. And then, just as the world around her seemed to break apart, she understood. The house was not simply a place. It was a living entity, and it had been waiting for her to remember, to claim what was hers. She had always belonged here. This house had never been her prison. It had been her legacy. The light in the room dimmed further, and the walls seemed to draw closer, as though the house were embracing her, pulling her into its very heart. She felt herself fading, her body dissolving into the air, into the stone, into the shadows. Her breath slowed, her pulse quieted, and the house's heartbeat became her own. The door behind her creaked open, though she couldn't bring herself to look. There was nothing left to leave behind. She was already part of the house, part of its endless story. She had stepped into the very heart of its memory, and there was no way to turn back now. In that final moment, Elara knew that she had become one with the house. Her spirit would linger within its walls forever, bound to it as the others had been, as they all had been. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed them, and in its depths, she would remain. Its keeper, its prisoner, its eternal soul. And somewhere, in the distance, there was the faintest echo of a whisper, a promise fulfilled.